All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today on a Saturday of all things. Welcome to our 5th lecture of our series. My name is Natasha Wingreen. I am the Outreach Director at New Haven Reads. At New Haven Reads, our mission is to increase the literacy skills of children by providing individually tailored one-on-one after-school tutoring, educational family support, and a community book bank, all at no cost to participants. In addition to our free book bank and one-on-one tutoring program, New Haven Reads offers early readiness classes for pre-K and kindergarten students, as well as a resource for teachers. In March, our tutoring program reached over 500 students weekly with 375 active volunteers. While our programming has had to adapt in recent months, we continue to support our students and families through online tutoring and book bank distribution sites. Through this lecture series, we are excited to hear from experts likewise invested in promoting literacy and expanding educational access, and to share this experience and knowledge with the wider New Haven community. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture. So just a few housekeeping items. To help ensure for a quality experience for all, please keep yourself on mute during the whole lecture. To see the speaker only, please adjust to the speaker view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And then following the lecture, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please do so by typing a private message to the host, which is me, in the chat function in Zoom, and then I will read your question to our guest speaker for a response. So we are so thrilled to introduce Alan Plattus. So Alan Plattus is a professor of architecture and urbanism at the Yale School of Architecture. He has an independent practice as an urban planning consultant and has lectured across the country and abroad on architectural theory, urban history, and contemporary urbanism. He also founded and directs the Yale Urban Design Workshop, a community design center based at the School of Architecture that has pursued practice-based research on the form and function of neighborhoods, towns, and regions, and has undertaken civic design projects in cities and towns throughout Connecticut. Professor Plattus teaches both undergrad and graduate courses at Yale School of Architecture, as well as a popular Yale College course on New Haven and the American City. He was Associate Dean of the school for 10 years, and he was the director of the school's Ph.D. program, and he received a BA summa cum laude from Yale in 1976 and his Master's of Architecture degree at Princeton University in 1979. Please welcome Alan Plattus.
Great to be here, and many thanks to New Haven Reads for all that they do and for hosting this series. I'm coming to you more or less live from Mount Desert Island in Maine, where it's a beautiful late summer day, just a touch of fall in the air. So without further ado, I'll dive in because our time is limited, and I'm sure on a nice Saturday afternoon, all of you have things to do. So a word or two about my title, starting with the subtitle. The phrase right to public space actually is based on a powerful and famous concept articulated by the French sociologist and philosopher Henri Lefebvre in a famous 1967 essay by the same title. And in a nutshell, his argument is that public space and public goods in general in the city have two dimensions. One is their everyday use value to ordinary people. The other is their exchange value as commodities from which certain interests profit. And he argues, and it's been a very influential argument from Brazil to London to Los Angeles and back to Paris, that use value should take precedence over exchange value. And you'll see how that plays out. The main title, Plan Inequality, simply is a way of arguing, as I will, that much of what we see around us today in cities like New Haven, the persistent and even worsening segregation and radical inequality of wealth is not an accident. And not just something that naturally happens, but is either, in many cases, the result of very self-conscious planning, policy, and project decisions, or in some cases, an more or less inadvertent side effect of people and powerful institutions acting in their own self-interest without regard to the consequences for mostly more vulnerable groups of people. So that's the framework. And to illustrate it, I want to begin with two important maps which coincidentally were published in the same year, 1937. The one on your left is a map produced by a New Deal organization based in Washington, founded in 1933 with the ostensible mission of dealing with mortgage defaults during the Great Depression. And this organization, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, produced similar maps for a vast number of American cities in which they mapped mortgage and lending risk. But what they were really doing, and they made no bones about it, is mapping racial division in cities and divisions of income. And the red areas that you see are by and large predominantly African American neighborhoods, neighborhoods of low income and high social distress. And what this map does has a name. It's called redlining, and it's been with us ever since. The other map was produced by a curious figure, Arnold Dana, who was a Yale alum who lived in New Haven and compiled a vast trove of history and current information about the city. And his scrapbooks are one of the most valuable resources in the Whitney Library of the New Haven Museum and are there for all our use. This particular map, again, 1937, maps tax-exempt property in central New Haven. And it's in the aquamarine color, and you will immediately recognize what most of it is. And we'll come back to that. Lest you think I'm exaggerating the importance of these two artifacts from another era, recent research like these maps by our own data haven, but also countless papers and projects in other cities, has confirmed that current divisions in contemporary cities like New Haven of race and persistent income and wealth inequality correspond directly to the redlining of certain districts in the city as early as 1937. There are other maps of interest here. In 1910, when the business leaders of New Haven commissioned a major new city plan, one of the maps that the authors assembled, based mainly on research by Yale undergraduates at the time, was this one. The black areas represent those areas of the city underserved by public open space, by parks. And it's very predictable. There are any number of other maps you can imagine that would also reinforce the same story. These deep divides in our body politic and in the space of our city correspond to limited or no access to crucial resources. Open space, which we know these days in the age of COVID is particularly important. Mortgage lending, good neighborhood schools, libraries, what have you, is pretty much a function of the way in which the critical institutions of power have mapped and used the space of the city to their own ends. Well, to stick with the 1910 plan for a moment, the authors of the plan, the architect Cass Gilbert and the landscape firm Frederick Law Olmsted, had answers to these problems. For example, you see on the upper left an ambitious plan for a linked park system an emerald necklace, as they call it in Boston, of parks, which would not only connect existing parks, but provide new parks for underserved areas. We're still trying to realize this visionary plan. But the other thing the plan did, not surprisingly, is to reinforce the powerful centering forces of the old industrial economy, which was fueling the growth of New Haven with new immigrants and new businesses and expanding industrial base, all of that, to reinforce that with brand new monumental public institutions. Like I show you a new library, which you'll recognize still very much with us on the green, and a monumental new train station, both designed by Cass Gilbert. The train station, of course, was realized in a somewhat less bombastic architectural mode. The other important dynamic that was ongoing at the same time was one of the largest internal migrations of people within the United States that we've ever seen. And it's been called the Great Migration, written about beautifully by Isabel Wilkerson, if you want to pursue it. And this map shows the massive migration of African American families from the South to the industrial Midwest and industrial Northeast, including New Haven. The irony is that as they arrived, the very jobs that drew them and the opportunities that went with those jobs that had propelled previous generations of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe, to new opportunities in these industrial cities were beginning to gradually and then not so gradually disappear. And again, Dana precociously anticipated that with this map of the old carriage industry district in New Haven around Worcester Square, which was already before the war beginning to erode. Why? Because a guy named Henry Ford in Detroit was producing personal mobility in a much more efficient way than the old carriage factories. But even Winchester and in Hartford Colt and in Bridgeport Remington, which got a continuing boost from wars through the Korean War, were beginning to be in trouble. And these maps, together with those dynamics, depict a kind of perfect storm. If you can see my cursor, I will focus on this one patch of red for a moment. That is the old Dixwell neighborhood. As you know, a historically African American community, which had been depicted by the HOLC map as a slum and therefore targeted for redevelopment. That occurred almost exactly at the same time in the late 30s when that very patch of red was bulldozed and replaced by New Haven's first public housing project, which initially was really working class housing associated with Winchester factory, which you can just see at the back of the upper left-hand slide. This image is taken from the recently completed new Yale Gymnasium. And that project anticipates something that would begin to be more explicit as a planning move after the war. In particular, the radical division created partly by the city of New Haven itself, following those old maps, and also partly by Yale in its expansion, and then by Yale and New Haven together as totally explicit planning ideas like an inner ring road that would form a kind of great wall around downtown New Haven and Yale. One effect of this was relevant to our discussion, and that was that still in the 50s, right across the street from the new Yale gym was a cluster of New Haven high schools. It was really the epicenter of New Haven secondary education. It included the commercial high school, the vocational high school, Boardman, and the academic high school, Hill House. And at the time, there was a kind of uneasy balancing act. And we all know stories of young people who grew up in New Haven neighborhoods, like my teacher, Vincent Scully, went to Hill House and then went on across the street, literally, to Yale. But by the 60s, Yale had acquired that site, and you can see in the lower right, they cleared it, and of course, initially did surface parking there in preparation for yet more expansion. We know where Hill House went to clear the way. It didn't exactly disappear to the suburbs, but it was now in a suburban style building. reflecting what was going on out in the world, because these grand plans to save New Haven uh, in the wake of declining industry and downtown retail and rapid suburbanization after the war were in fact mainly highway plans and had, you might say, the unintended consequence, although there are darker interpretations, of actually doing the opposite, facilitating new patterns of residential and commercial and educational development in the suburbs with easy automobile access for those who could afford it back to jobs in the city, or not, as the case may be. So, for example, on Dixwell Avenue site out in Hamden by the future Merritt Parkway, another post-war highway project, you get not only Hamden High School, but the first suburban shopping center in the New Haven region, Hamden Plaza. And meanwhile, Yale is building its 11th and 12th residential colleges on precisely the site of the old high school. And as it expands, of course, it takes ever more property off the tax rolls, making it more and more difficult to use the shrinking tax base to support continuing quality education and other public services. But it was not an unambiguously negative story. One move Yale made, which I think turns out to have enormous significance, is the decision to build a new museum for British art across Chapel Street on the south side and make the leap of the campus beyond Chapel Street towards the hospital, but also to include ground floor retail, which we all know and use, Atticus and other shops. And also, we would see eventually to begin the process of making downtown New Haven now anchored by no longer department stores like Mally's, but by cultural institutions, museums, theaters, and the like. And the reason New Haven has been able to do better than some old industrial cities, Bridgeport, Waterbury, Springfield, is precisely because as it lost industry, as it lost big scale regional retail, culture and other uses took up some of the slack. For example, what more poignant transformation than the transformation of Church Street from the shopping mall intended to save downtown retail, and finally abandoned and replaced by Gateway Community College, another important educational institution. So education is, having been exiled initially, except for Yale, is now creeping back into the center of the city where everybody can use it, like the downtown library. Not just Yale, but importantly, Gateway, which arguably, from a New Haven perspective, is as important as Yale, not as big, not as rich, but much more important in connecting young people to meaningful jobs that replace the old jobs that left with heavy industry in sectors like healthcare. And so in the transition to an economy based on what we call meds and eds, New Haven is repositioning itself. But the story is a bit different in neighborhoods. Whereas neighborhoods were once many communities in their own right, anchored by elementary schools, by small locally owned businesses, by churches, synagogues, civic institutions. In the redevelopment era, a lot of that left was suburbanized, or it was reconstructed, as was the Dwight School, on suburban models. And over time, that familiar neighborhood institution changed literally its relationship. The final, or at least most recent, evolution is to reinvent the Dwight School as the Amistad Academy, a charter school, leaving the Dwight neighborhood with no neighborhood elementary school. In between these two endpoints, we found ourselves, we being the Yale Urban Design Workshop and the School of Architecture, involved with the Dwight neighborhood. And naturally, there was a focus on the schools and on education as critical to the ability of neighborhoods to keep up with what was actually happening in the city and the region as a whole. And we built at that time with the neighborhood a new community room addition to what was still a public elementary school. And more importantly, we were able to build with the neighborhood a daycare center. And you know that no educational sector, not even community colleges, is more critical to the ability people to access opportunity in a rapidly changing economic and social context. And so these two projects, along with others, were meant to regrow a legitimate educationally based neighborhood center. And as the work developed, we actually tried to reconstitute Edgewood Avenue as a kind of neighborhood main street that would link these resources, the Troop uh, uh, Magnet School, the Dwight School, the daycare center, new commercial on Whaley Avenue, and to make it a local version of the kind of connected network of public open space available to all that Gilbert and Olmsted had anticipated in their visionary plan back in 1910, but with a big difference, because the way in which this kind of planning was undertaken was not the old style way of lots of old, well-fed white guys sitting around a table in a private club somewhere in the center city. But it was meant to be a participatory and inclusive process, including the leadership of the city. And you see much younger John DeStefano and Matt Nemerson, local police and students and community folks. And the plan, of course, was ultimately to increase ownership and access at the same time, much like the new kind of public space represented by projects like the Farmington Canal Greenway. And it just, we think, we hope, looks different. I'll end with a little story. So we were able to return in 2007 to update the neighborhood plan, and the planning workshop took place in the very building, the new addition to the Dwight School that had come out of the last planning process. And I show you a poignant view of that workshop. The people here are, first of all, Vanessa Mendoza, who had grown up in New Haven, gone to local schools, went on to Yale College, where she majored in architecture school and got involved in our workshop. Vanessa then went on to Harvard Graduate School of Design, getting an architecture degree, and followed that up with an MBA from Harvard. She is now the vice president based in Washington of Teach for America. Across the table from Vanessa is a much beloved and missed neighborhood leader, West Indian immigrant, Winston Ireland, who was instrumental in moving forward many of these projects. This is a different kind of public planning from the old style, where predictable characters like New Haven's own Mayor Lee or New York's own Robert Moses, who, by the way, grew up in New Haven and went to Yale before he went on to become New York City's power broker, and even Gary Cooper playing Howard Rourke in the movie version of Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. These guys not only are predictably homogeneous, they strike the same poses of expertise and authority, and apparently also go to the same tailor. Things have changed, and people change them, and planning should look different now. Jane Jacobs in the early 60s took on Robert Moses and won. And planning continues to evolve with the goal of making real public spaces and services accessible to all, not only as shared community space where we find each other as a community, but also importantly space where we have access to air our concerns and differences as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. We do have some questions coming in, so we'll start the Q&A now. If you have a question, just write it in the chat. So first question is, can you comment on Guida administration's resistance to Yale's expansion, which blocked several projects, including the Graduate Housing and Social Center on the corner of Grove and Whitney?
So the corner of Grove and Whitney has an interesting personal connection for me. Actually, several. The original project for that, which was blocked by activists, by the preservation community, and ultimately by the city, was for 2 additional residential colleges, which were totally designed and funded by a gift from the Whitney family, which was subsequently used to renovate the old campus. And there were then numerous proposals, and in the end, what you got is Whitney Grove, private development, but now very much shared with Yale. And it was a kind of parable of the evolution of public sector or institutional planning to a more privatized or public-private model of plan development. Where I came in was that during all this controversy, I was in architecture school in New Jersey, and I chose to do my thesis project for grad school on that very site. So I followed it, and it's a part of a dialectic. Yale was stopped there, but at the same time, they were doing the British Art Center, and the compromise there was including the ground floor retail, which I think pretty much everybody would say was a big success over time.
And just a second comment to that is that the person who asked the question said that they didn't know you had a connection to it and it was not a setup question.
Okay.
So there's another comment that just says bravo to Alan Plattus. And then another question, which is, what has the response and engagement of New Haven's community been like through the years with respect to the changing landscape of schools?
Well, when I sat down to think about this after Natasha gave me my assignment, I thought, well, you could talk for weeks about this. But, you know, the story of schools is so central to every American city and their health and success for the widest number of people. And New Haven has had its ups and downs, obviously. They made heroic efforts under the DeStefano administration to refurbish and rebuild aging schools, to develop programs like the magnet schools, the arts high school, and to be innovative and inventive about how they deal with the very limited pot of resources they have. We all, I think, understand that the ultimate challenge is how schools are funded in this country mostly, which is by local property tax. And when you have a city which has gone through what New Haven has, and then only has 23 square miles of land to deal with. And a lot of that, as we've said, already spoken for by tax-exempt institutions. It's a pretty difficult game. And I think most of us recognize that the ultimate challenge is not to continue to squeeze a limited number of property owners for more and more resources, but to challenge the whole structure. That is not so easy politically. It's much easier to fight the same old battles locally than it is to go to Hartford and challenge the structure of state finance.
Right. Thank you. We have another comment. Agree with the Bravo. That was a great talk and its relevance to American cities in the situation of today. And then one last question. Is there government-led urban thinking happening in New Haven right now that you can comment on?
Well, the answer is yes. The qualification is that the current administration has come in to an unprecedented situation, as we know. The twin challenges nationally of the pandemic and also the revival of really urgent and related demand for greater equality, greater recognition of historic injustice has caught this administration at the outset. And so we should recognize that what they've been able to do under these challenging conditions is to try to keep momentum going on projects which were already underway. And what's driving those projects is, of course, still robust market for mainly downtown rental housing. And you can't make a city in the long run out of that alone. So there is a need, once we get back to some semblance of normal, to find a way to leverage that sector of planning and development to address a wide range of pressing needs. And I'm pretty confident that folks in City Hall had that in their sights. And we'll see if they're able to get back to those longer term visionary projects once we get through the current challenges. But people in City Hall, although it's a reduced cohort, have been there all along. I will just pick on one person, my former student, Doug Hausleiten. Doug has been working away on pedestrian and bicycle mobility, which around the world has been a key to successful, sustainable urban development in cities like Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and elsewhere. And he's done, given the limited resources, a significant things in New Haven, which has the advantage of a compact, walkable size and very walkable neighborhoods. And so we have the ideas and the commitment, but not at the current moment the kind of resources we need.
Thank you. So we'd like to say thank you to Alan Plattus. Thank you for your lecture today. And thank you guys for participating in our 5th lecture of our series this summer. We will be putting this lecture up on our website, but also sending everybody a video link to those who've registered. And then please join us next Saturday, August 22nd, for Dr. Brian Brown, and he'll be discussing race, language, and culture and its impacts in urban classrooms. So thank you again, Alan Plattus. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Happy Saturday.